where he had made his name and was often referred to as Chinese Gordon. As well as his military exploits, he was a devout Anglican Christian who spent much of his time in Palestine looking for biblical sites. As a result, the Garden Tomb, as we now call it, for many years was called Gordon's Tomb. And Gordon's reputation was only enhanced by his death in 1885 in Khartoum in the Sudan, besieged by the Islamic self-styled prophet, the Mahdi. These events were portrayed in the 1966 film Khartoum, with Laurence Olivier playing the Mahdi and Charlton Heston, Gordon. We mention Gordon's involvement in the discovery of the Gordon or Garden Tomb because, as we shall see later, a great deal of the attribution issue tends to turn upon the status of the personalities involved. A Roman emperor, a saint, and a British military hero who died a brave and romantic death. In time, the family owning the site decided to sell. It was already becoming a prime item of real estate, and the Times of September 22, 1892 carried an appeal to raise £2,000 to buy it. 2 years later, the site had been bought and excavations begun under the leadership of two redoubtable women amateur archaeologists, Charlotte Hussey and Louisa Holt. The excavation took almost half a century, but in the end, the site was very much as we see it today. From time immemorial, it had been called Skull Hill, and Golgotha is Aramaic for the place of the skull. If we look at the site from here, we can clearly see the shape of the eye sockets and the nose. Gordon was sure that this was the correct site because St. John tells us that at the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, in which no one had ever been buried. According to the Gospels, the tomb belonged to Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy merchant who had the tomb made for himself and his family. The speed of events in Holy Week took the disciples by surprise. It was evening, the Sabbath was the next day, and Jesus had to be buried now. Joseph's act of generosity singles him out down the generations, so we know his name and we know what he did. This site features in the Old Testament, where it is called Mount Moriah, and where Abraham was told by God to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. So, the symbolism of this place in both Jewish and Christian terms is very great. The team were conscious wherever they walked that their steps fell on ground which had been holy for thousands of years. It was a very moving experience, and one that filled them with awe as the guide left them to explore on their own, to contemplate this place and consider the evidence. St. John tells us that the site where Jesus was crucified and where he was buried was outside the city walls, somewhere high up that could be seen from a long way off. The whole point of crucifixion is that it is highly visible, a terrible deterrent for anyone threatening the Roman state. A century before the death of Jesus, in 70 BC, the slave Spartacus led a rebellion that was put down so brutally that almost 7,000 men from his army were crucified on a great avenue of crosses along the Appian Way. The Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, at least allowed Jesus' followers to take his body down from the cross and bury him. Nobody gave the order to take Spartacus's men down, and their skeletons hung for years. This was a very brutal time, and crucifixion a very brutal death. The Garden Tomb is a short walk from the old city walls, near the Damascus Gate, and just around the corner is the tomb itself.
City wall down there. That's Mount Moriah, the north end up there. And that's skull over there.
As you can see, the door into the tomb is quite small, but the tomb itself roomy, about 14.5 feet by 10 and 7.5 feet high, which is quite high considering that few men stood more than 6 feet tall. The entrance would be made intentionally small to deter grave robbers. To the front, we see the weeping chamber. The mourners would be women. On the right, here, a low wall hewn from the rock divides the room. Below, a pillow has been cut out of the rock, and beyond, an unfinished tomb, perhaps intended for Joseph of Arimathea's wife. There is a small window in the outer wall.
If you look up here, you can see what appears to be a window in the tomb. We're not actually certain what it was for. It could have been for ventilation purposes. On the other hand, some Jewish tombs of that period had a thing called a nephesh, a Hebrew word that means soul hole. And the Jews believed that after the body had been in the tomb for 3 days, the spirit departed through that window. Now it's interesting because if you remember when Jesus raised Lazarus from the grave, he waited for 4 days before doing it. Do you remember? Now he waited probably for 4 days because had he done it earlier, people would have said the spirit was still in the body and he wasn't truly dead. So we believe that's why he waited. So it's interesting, isn't it? Now the other interesting feature of this window is it allows light to fall on that grave there where we believe the body of Jesus would have rested. And that would explain why John was able to bend over and look in and actually see to the tomb and see the linen cloth lying there, because I feel if it was one of those other tombs he'd be looking into a black hole and would not have been able to see. So again, it does fit the biblical picture.
The tomb is certainly large enough for Peter and John to enter it and find 2 angels seated where Jesus' body had lain, one at the head and the other at the foot. Only the finished loculus, the grave area, looks to have been used, and there is no sign that any other body was ever here.
Covering the tomb that you can see in front of you, except that this right-hand side had collapsed, we think, due to earthquake damage, and at that time they strengthened it with these stone blocks. Now when you go into the tomb, don't think it's a natural cave that's been adapted as a tomb. It's not. It's been cut out of the rock just as described in the Bible, and it's a large and impressive tomb, speaking of it being the tomb of a rich man like Joseph of Arimathea. A poor person couldn't afford a tomb of this kind. Now when it was in use as a tomb, the entrance was much lower than you see it at the moment. We think it was only about 1 meter high, so you'd have to bend down to look into it or to go into it. And as you probably know, it was sealed by a large rolling stone, wasn't it? Now we've never found that original stone, but it would have looked a little like that one behind you. Can you see that one there? That one's dated back to that period, so it gives you some idea of what it looked like.
There's no smell or sense of decay. If this had been Joseph of Arimathea's unfinished family tomb, it would almost certainly have looked like this. Jesus rose from the dead in 3 days, and his body did not decay. That the tomb was prepared in a hurry. Here are the chisel marks to show where the rock was hollowed out. But something is far more interesting. Someone has extended the loculus. The burial chamber has been extended to make a body several inches taller than the person it was intended for. We know that if this is the tomb used to bury Jesus, The stonemason was in a hurry because all preparations had to be completed by the Sabbath. The tomb was originally designed for someone 5 feet 8 inches tall, quite tall in ancient times. The localus has been hastily lengthened, and the space is now something over 6 feet. It is believed that Jesus was around the same height as our cameraman, 5 feet 11 inches tall. Now we come to investigate the area outside the tomb. There is a large cistern which confirms that it was almost certainly a garden in Jesus' time. The dry climate meant saving water for irrigation in underground containers in the rock. This cistern holds 250,000 gallons of water, the third largest in Jerusalem, and it must have been used to irrigate a large and luxuriant garden.
If I could remind you of a verse in John's Gospel, do you remember? It says in John's Gospel that at the place where Jesus was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Now we've seen the possible site of the crucifixion at that place called Skull Hill. Here we are in a beautiful garden, but what's the evidence to say there was a garden here at the time of Jesus? If you look at this photograph, I think this shows you part of the evidence that tells us there was a garden here at that time. This is a very large water cistern. As you know, they dug them all over Israel in the past, didn't they, to store the rainwater in the winter so they had plenty of water for the dry season. This one, the head of it, is just over there and it goes deep underground. It's the third largest water cistern in Jerusalem and it takes about 1 million litres of water, and it's been dated back to pre-Christian times, so it's over 2,000 years old. So it was certainly here at the time of Jesus. Now the discovery of this cistern and also an ancient wine press that's been found here tell us this was a garden at that time, not the sort of garden that you're looking at now, but we believe it was a cultivated area, and we think it was probably a vineyard for growing grapes with lots of water in this to water those grapes. Now because it's so extensive, it also suggests that it's a garden of a rich man like Joseph of Arimathea. We know he was wealthy, don't we? The Bible tells us. And if you remember, he and Nicodemus, they'd both become secret followers of Jesus, hadn't they? But in the end, they had the courage to come out in the open, and they went to Pilate, the Roman governor, asked for his body, and the Bible says they buried him in Joseph's own new tomb. So all the three things described in John's Gospel are found here on this site. So you can see how well it does fit the biblical account.
Just such a garden as would belong to a wealthy merchant like Joseph of Arimathea. Yards away, we have a wine press, which must have been used for the garden's fruit. It was there before Jesus' burial and is one of the largest ever found in Israel. The cistern and the winepress are circumstantial evidence, but the most telling piece of evidence is just outside the tomb. St. Matthew tells us that after Jesus' body was prepared for burial and the disciples had sent their farewells, the tomb was closed by rolling a huge circular stone across the entrance and sealing it in place. The heavy stone and seal were fitted on the orders of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor.
Sir,
they said,
we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, "After 3 days I will rise again." So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he's been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first.
take a guard,